Well, like the man said, I'm a storyteller. I tell the old folk tales, the old fairy tales, old stories, and people have forgotten them by now, which is too bad. But history is stories too. So this afternoon I'm going to tell you a little bit of both. Now, I've lived in Genesee country for about 27 years, and I got curious. Who settled here, and why? And with all deep and due respect, the Seneca people were the first ones here. The first European settlers of Livingston County were the Scots and the Irish, which surprised me. I thought it was going to be English, but it was Scots and Irish. Now, the Scots left their home country to come to America because home got dangerous. The landlords were raising the rent. And we've all heard that one before. But those same landlords were saying to their tenants, I'm going to tell you what you can and can't do with the land you just rented for me. And Scots being Scots, they weren't going to put up with that. And on top of that, the British government, the Crown, said, you will be the religion I tell you to be, or I will burn your house down. Or worse, and I'll spare you all of the gory details of all of that. And in that time, during the 17th and 18th centuries, a lot of the European powers said, you will be the religion we say you're going to be. So the Scots came, freedom from religious persecution, and rich lands. Now the Irish came because of freezing weather. Crop-killing, freezing weather. This isn't the potato famine. That's a long time later. 1720, 1740, 1771, nothing grew in Ireland. So they came here for food and safety. Anybody know a town called Belfast? Well, yeah, there's one in Northern Ireland. There's one about 45 minutes from here. So they brought their culture with them. Now, it was a long way over here. We could just fly over there in a day. Well, back then, in a Mayflower-style ship, 8 to 16 weeks on the open ocean, and you didn't even know whether you were really going to make it. And America was seen as a rich place to go. A pot of gold. Oh, do let me tell you a story. Now, once there was a fella named Patrick O'Donnell, and he lived in Donegal, Northwest Ireland. And Patrick went to the county fair. And he was on his way home after a day at the county fair. The moon was out. It was a beautiful night. The road was pretty even. Walking along. Go up a rise in the road. And off in the bog, Patrick heard a little cry. And he said to himself, now that is not the cry of a little animal. And it is not the cry of a little baby. But it is a cry for help, so I will go and look. So he stepped off the road into the bog. Now the bog in Ireland can be a dangerous place. Irish people even now think there are pits with no bottom that you might fall into without knowing it. But it was a cry for help, so Patrick went. And the part of the bog that he stepped off into was covered with blackthorn bushes. Thorns as long as your finger. Big, dangerous bushes. But he was hearing the cry, so he walked and walked through the bushes. And there, on one bush, hanging from a great big long blackthorn, was a little wee fairy. And Patrick said, Well, now how did you get yourself into this trouble, little man that you are? And the fairy said, well, never mind that. Just get me down. I'm likely to die up here if you don't. So Patrick stepped up closer to the bush, and as he stepped closer, he kicked something on the ground. And he looked down, and it was a little tiny cobbler's bench. Leprechauns make shoes. Aha, said Patrick to himself and to the leprechaun. And he walked over, and he said, it is a leprechaun that you are. Well, so what if I am? Just get me off of this thorn and be careful you don't tear the breeches, because they're a new pair and I don't want a hole in them. And Patrick was full of wonderment, for he knew he wasn't going to take his eyes off the leprechaun. And he also knew by all the laws of fairy trade that the leprechaun had to tell him where the pot of gold was. So he grabbed the leprechaun by the back of his neck and the seat of his breeches, lifted him off the thorn, didn't tear the breeches, he was careful, lifted him off. And he says, all right now, you're going to tell me where the gold is. Oh, no, said the leprechaun, you're going to put me down. Patrick said, no, I'm not. I'm not going to take my eyes off of you until you tell me where the gold is, because you really have to do that, and I'm not going to let you go until you tell me. Where's the gold? Gold, said the leprechaun. What's gold to you? What's it to me, said Patrick. It's the making of the O'Donnell family fortune. And we'll be comfortable, we'll have food, we'll have clothes, it will be marvelous, and you're going to tell me where it is. Well, no, I'm not, said the leprechaun, and there arose between the two of them quite the argument and the palaver. And it went on and on and on. And the leprechaun said, well, all right, I'll show you. And he directed Patrick among and between and around all of those blackthorn bushes until they got to one in particular, and the leprechaun said, it's that one. Underneath that blackthorn bush, if you dig, you'll find the pot of gold. Well, said Patrick, I didn't bring a shovel. Who brings a shovel to the county fair? And the leprechaun said, well, that's hardly my problem now, isn't it? And there wasn't an argument now. There was a silence between the two. And Patrick finally said, I have it. I have it. I'm going to take off my bright red kerchief and I'm going to tie it around that bush with a special knot, and I'm going to go home and get my shovel, and that way I'll know what bush it is when I get back. And the leprechaun said, well, you just do that and you can put me down on the ground now, can't you? And Patrick said, well, yes, I can. And he put the leprechaun down, who was gone in less than a blink of an eye. And Patrick ran home down the road. It was a long way home. He went in the front door, grabbed the shovel, ran out the front door, because that's Irish good luck, ran back up the road toward the bog. And as he ran, the sun was just painting the sky gold as he got to the blackthorn forest, and he set off into the blackthorns until he noticed around every blackthorn bush, every single one, there was a red kerchief, just like Patrick's, and tied in exactly the same special knot. Patrick said, well, I'm never going to be able to dig them up. There's 40 good Irish acres here. So he grabbed his shovel and walked off home. And that, as they say, was the end of the O'Donnell family fortune. But it's not the end of that story. You see, Patrick told that story to his granddaughter, who told it to a folktale collector named Ruth Sawyer, whose books are in our library. But she didn't publish it. She told it to another folktale collector, whose books are also in our library. Hamilton, Virginia Hamilton. And I read Virginia Hamilton's version of that story so that I could tell it to you. Stories have their own stories. Thank you. Now, it was a long way over here, but folks came anyway. I can't believe they did that. I can't believe they got on the... Of course, that was all there was the boats with the sails. Another big cause of Irish and Scottish immigration here was a thing called impressment. The British Navy decided that they needed more men. So they would go to the ports, to Dublin, Belfast, Edinburgh, and they would grab men, young men, say, "You're in the Navy now." And the men didn't have a choice. The big men of war sailing ships would stop, sail up to merchant vessels, much smaller ships, and impress half the crew and leave those ships almost stranded. And the Irish and the Scottish people, they were frightened and furious. So let me tell you a story, a Scottish story about, a bit of a different kind of impressment. You see, there was a baker. Anybody here like pies and cakes and cookies? Everyone loved her baking. She was the best in all the counties around her. Whenever there was a birthday party, a celebration, a funeral, an anniversary, everybody wanted the master baker to bake for them. So when the king's daughter got married, of course it was the master baker who was asked to make all of the baked goods for the whole celebration. She worked and worked and worked for days and took the same path from her house to the castle, back to her house. But someone was watching. You see, did you ever put the last piece of cake and save it, or the last cookie and save it, but it's gone in the morning when you go looking for it, and nobody will claim that they ate it? Because the fairies like pies and cakes and cookies as much as we do. But with the master baker, there were never any crumbs left. So the fairies had been watching the master baker. And they decided, as she came home from the last night of baking, exhausted, more tired than she'd ever been, and she said, I'm going to have to sit down and take a rest. I can't make it home. Little did she know that the fairies had been sprinkling fern dust in the air, which makes you sleepy. She sat down, rested her head on a certain hill, and woke up in fairyland. She knew exactly where she was. She had an idea of why she was there. She also had an idea of how she was going to get out. She had no intention of baking pies and cakes and cookies for the rest of her existence for the fairies. So she greeted the fairy king and queen, said, "I'm here to make you a cake, I'm sure." And all the fairies, they quivered. They were so excited to have a whole cake just for them. And the master baker said, "Well, I'll need a bowl." And the fairy queen nodded, and up stepped a fairy with a bowl. And the master baker said, "Well, someone's going to have to go to my house and get the mixing bowl that's on top of the green water barrel." So a fairy was sent, 3 or 4 fairies. They brought the bowl back. Master baker said, "Excellent. Now I need the mixing spoon, the measuring spoons, the measuring cups." 5 fairies went to fetch all of those things. "Excellent," said the master baker. "And now I need the flour and the sugar and the eggs and the oil and the vanilla and the butter. A dozen fairies went to fetch all of those things. And there she was ready. She was ready, and the fairies were flying around. They were so excited, peering over the master baker's shoulder to watch her make this cake. And she's measuring, putting things in the bowl, cracking the eggs, making sure everything is right. And she begins to stir. But then she put the spoon down. She said, I need the dog. You see, the dog snores, and it makes a rhythm with the way I stir. And if I don't have the rhythm, then the cake doesn't come out right. Oh, said the king, well, that can't happen. Someone go fetch the dog. 10 fairies went to fetch the dog. Dog was brought, settled down by his mistress' feet, put his nose down, began to snore. So the snoring and the stirring, and it was wonderful, until the master baker put the spoon down again. I need the cat on the other side. You see, the cat purrs, and the dog snores, and I stir, and if I don't have all 3 of it, then the cake's not going to come out right. I'm not sure how many fairies it took to go get the cat, but they got the cat. Cat settled down by his mistress's feet, purred, snored, stirred. Oh, it was going to be a wonderful cake. Until the master baker put the spoon down. And the fairy king and queen said, what is it? She said, I'm afraid it's my baby's dinner time, and he's going to cry, and he doesn't let his daddy feed him. If you go get him, I need my baby. So they did send some very careful fairies to go and fetch the baby. But the minute the baby saw his mother, you all know what happened. He screamed. Of course he screamed. But the master baker knew he'd do that. So she grabbed the baby. So the cat's purring, the dog is snoring, she's stirring, the baby is screaming. And the master baker said, well, maybe if you go get my husband, he can get the baby to be quiet and we get this cake made. All the fairies practically went to get the husband. Now imagine the husband sitting at home of this evening, watching things disappear out of his house. But if he noticed what it was that was disappearing, it was all baking things. He figured his wife was behind it. And if his wife was behind it, he knew she was a clever woman and everything would be all right. Fairies brought him under the fairy hill, handed him the baby, who of course wasn't any quieter. But there's one thing that the master baker knew about fairies. You need to know. Fairies don't like a lot of noise. So underneath the screaming of the baby, the master baker leaned over and said to her husband, step on the cat's tail and pinch the dog. Which wasn't very kind, said the husband, but he knew it was part of the plan. So he did exactly that. So the cat is howling, the dog is barking, the baby is screaming, and the fairies are lying on the floor with their hands over their ears. And finally, the master baker gave the spoon to the baby, who licked at the batter, nodded to her husband, who stopped with the animals, and it was all quiet. And the master baker said, where's the oven? And the fairy king and queen sagged in their thrones. And the fairy king said, you may all go home. And the master baker said, I'll go home and bake the cake and leave it by that place where you found me. All you've wanted all this time was a cake, and I never made you one. Now the fairy king was not to be outdone. And he said, and what you find there, you may keep. And he raised his hand, and the side of the fairy hill opened. And the master baker collected the baby, the batter, all of the equipment, the cat, the dog. And they made a straight line to home. None of them looked back. They got home, fed the baby, put the cake in the oven. And when the cake was done, she took it back to the fairy hill as she had promised. And she found there a little bag of gold. And it wasn't fairy gold that disappeared the next morning. It was the real gold. So she began to bake cakes every month. And the relationship continued between the master baker and the fairies. And the baker, her husband, the little one, even the cat and the dog, they lived, as why should they not, happily ever after. Thank you. Now, like the baker and the fairies, what came next in America was business. The business of land. And understanding that business, I found out in all the research I did, is kind of like trying to sort the noodles in a plate of spaghetti. Now, during the Revolutionary War, battles were fought here in Genesee country because the Seneca had sided with the British. And a terrible command came down from George Washington. And the command was given to ruin the Seneca, destroy their villages, tear up the crops. And it was done. And after the war, in 1783, treaties were organized between the Iroquois. State boundaries were argued over and settled, which sounds easy, but land ownership got complicated. Wealthy men saw America as a land of opportunity to make money. And around here, there was a series of confusing land sales. One company to the next, to the next, to the next. Phelps and Gorham, John Livingston, Robert Morris, William Pulteney, who was a Scotsman. They bought millions of acres for the sole purpose of selling it. Most of them didn't make near as much as they thought they would. One or two of them lost their shirts in the process, but none of them actually lived here. Now, why would anybody come here? It was completely wild. There were no easy paths. There were no roads. There were no towns. The soldiers who fought here were given land, so a number of them stayed. A lot of them wrote home about how beautiful it was. Now, in 1792, a traveler here wrote glowing reasons about why to come. The land, the soil, the water, the game. He even mentioned the maple trees. And he quoted a poet who wrote during the war. Here, happy millions their own lands possess. No tyrant awes them, nor no lords oppress. Now, in 1790, they did a census, and there were 37 families. Some of them were English, and there was a family called Markham, and they had come up from Virginia, and they were land surveyors for Phelps and Gorham. They were also sheep farmers, but don't tell the British, because the British wanted a monopoly on the sheep, the wool, and the fabric. So it was an act of rebellion to own sheep. Now, the early 1790s were big years around here. Now, a lot of the towns we know they weren't legally incorporated, but they were established about then. And there were a lot of Scots and Irish. Now, there was a fellow named William McCartney who built a house up in Sparta, which became Dansville. And in 1793, the first school opened by a fellow named Samuel Murphy. And I'm sure you can tell where he might have been from. Oh, and then the next thing, there was a store by Alexander MacDonald. And he came from Scotland. And in 1795, particular especially to Dansville, James McCurdy was a Scotsman along with Cornelius McCoy from Ireland, and they built a log cabin. Now remember, there's nothing here. There's no sawmills. There's no industry of any kind. It's a lot of trees. So you build with logs. And they built a log cabin which was 18 feet by 14 feet, and they said, which we thought was a very large house. And that was the beginning of Dansville. Now, there were Englishmen, like the Markhams. The two Englishmen named Kane and Moffat were the first settlers of Caledonia. And they arrived in Big Springs in 1795 and built a house there, a tavern, out of logs. But a tavern was important back then. It wasn't just a place to drink. It was a place where you met people, where you asked for help, where you could stay if you were new in town. But the word got out that Kane and Moffat were not honest guys. They were thieves, they might even be murderers, and the rest of that town drove them out. When I told this story in Caledonia, they said, and nobody knows what happened to him. I'm not sure anybody was really looking. They were succeeded by an Irishman and an Englishman who set up another tavern. Now, 1796 was a really fun year around here. William McGee and his three brothers from Ireland started the little town of Groveland. And Jacob Collar came with the McNair family, which is still a family name around here, from the far-off state of New Jersey. And they had one horse and an ox team, but the condition of the routes through the forest to get here took them 28 days from New Jersey to Genesee country. Can you imagine? 28 days. Determined. And then this little fella named Daniel Faulkner moved in next to McCurdy and McCoy. And he was the one who laid out the streets. And it became the town of Dansville. And in 1799, 9 families moved to Big Springs. Peter Campbell, Malcolm McLaren, John McNaughton, Donald McVean, Hugh McDermott, John McPherson, Donald McPherson, Donald Anderson, and Alexander Thompson, all from Scotland. And they all moved to Big Springs, which we now know as Caledonia, which is an old word for Scotland. And those are the stories of just a few people that came here. But how did anybody find out about it? I mean, there were newspapers, but not over here. Well, the fella that ended up with more than 1 million acres was William Pulteney. But by law back then, the only people who could own land were citizens of America. So Pulteney hired a fellow named James Williamson, who became an American citizen, technically owned the land so that he could be the manager. And Williamson was a promoter. He advertised in newspapers in multiple states. He had roads built, although the people who traveled on the roads said they were just barely passable. He had lots of ideas, but he was also inclined to forget that he was really here to make money. He just wanted people to move here. Pulteney never realized a lot of return for his 1.2 million acre purchase. But folks came to settle here anyway. But a lot of them got mixed up on the way. You all know the name of Wadsworth. And Colonel Wadsworth, Jeremiah Wadsworth, was an older Englishman who lived in Connecticut. And he bought 200,000 acres. But he was too old to move here. So he gave 2,000 acres to his nephews, James and William, so they could be the land managers. So they traveled from Connecticut all the way across the raw state of New York with ox carts and horses, and William got lost. Apparently there was a big swamp northeast of Geneseo, and William just, as far as James knew, William disappeared. Well, everybody was worried about William. William tied his cattle to the trees, and they all slept on the ground that night. James finally found them, and they all slept in the carts and on the ground until the huts were built before they could build the houses. So there were all different layers of land ownership and land deals, and it got confusing about who was selling which plot of land to whom. There was the Bowers family who bought land at the north end of Hemlock Lake. And they had lots, and everything was divided up, and the Bowers family sold off pieces of their land. But before the purchasers arrived, there were squatters who came there first and said, "This is gorgeous. Nobody lives here." So they chopped down a few trees, built a house, and then along came the actual owners of the property, and arguments ensued that weren't satisfied for 2 years in the courts of New York State. So business and personal confusion and disorganization took a little while. Well, let me tell you another story, an English story about a young fella, learning the business of things. Now, once there was a little fella named Jack. There's lots of stories about Jack. And in this story with Jack, he lived with his mother in a poor little cottage, all by themselves. And Jack's mama loved her Jack. She'd make cookies, bring him apple juice underneath the tree in the springtime, cookies, hot cocoa by the fire in the wintertime. But, like all of us, Jack's mother was getting on, and she finally said to her son, Jack, I need you to get a job. A job, Mama, what's that? Jack, a job is you go and do work for someone, and they pay you in one way or another. Oh, that's a good idea, Mama, I'll do that. And Jack got a job with a farmer, digging rocks out of the ground. And in Genesee country, we know a lot about rocks on the ground. So Jack dug rocks and dug rocks and dug rocks all day long. He was a young fella, he was strong. And the farmer was very pleased with all the work that Jack had done, gave him 3 coins. Oh, Jack had never seen coins before. They were nice and bright and shiny. And on his walk home, he flipped one up in the air. Oh, it was beautiful and shiny in the sunshine, but it fell in the field, and Jack had no idea where. Now, Jack had to cross a creek on the way home. Skipped one across the creek, skipped 5 times before it sank all the way down to the bottom of the creek somewhere. Jack didn't know where, and then he realized he better take at least 1 coin home, so he held on to it tightly. But Jack's hand got sweaty, and that coin slipped out somewhere, so Jack came home with nothing. And Jack's mama said, Jack, what you should have done is put the coins in your pocket. You'd always know where they are. That's a good idea, Mama. I'll do that next time. And the next job that Jack got was with a dairy farmer. Jack was very good with the cows. Maybe he talked to them in their ears and they listened to him. He brushed them. I'm not sure the farmer showed him how to milk them. That's kind of a detailed thing. But he took them out to the field, make sure they were safe, brought them home, got them in their stalls. And the dairy farmer was so happy he gave Jack a whole quart of milk. And Jack said, I remember what Mama said, and he took that quart of milk and poured it right down his pocket. So by the time he got home, Jack was going squat, 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 squat. And Jack's mama said, oh, Jack, what you should have done was put it on your head. She knew her son, so you know where it was. And Jack said, that's a good idea, Mama. I'll do that next time. And the next job that Jack got was with a baker. Now, Jack knew about ovens. He was very careful with the bread and the cookies that they came in and out. He arranged them nicely in the display cases. He took very good care of the customers, made an exact change. Now, the baker was not the most generous fella in the world. He did not give Jack a loaf of bread. What he gave Jack was a cat, an old barn cat. He said, I'm sure your mother can use this to keep the mice out of the house. And Jack remembered what his mama had said. Try to put under his hand. The only thing Jack came home with was a face full of scratches. And his mama said, Jack, what you should have done was tie a string around its neck and lead it home that way. And Jack said, oh, that's a good idea, Mama. I'll do that next time. And the next job that Jack got was with a butcher. Oh, and Jack was he was very careful with all those sharp knives. But he could slice the meats evenly. He could weigh things accurately. He make sure that everything was in the cold, that it didn't sit out in the heat for too long. And the butcher was so pleased with the work that Jack did. He said, Jack, I'm going to give you this whole roast to take home to your mama. And Jack remembered what his mama had said. And he took some of that butcher's string, tied it around the roast, and pulled it home after him. Along with every dog in town. And by the time he got home, Jack had what was left of a bone. And Jack's mama said, oh, Jack, we could have eaten for a week on that, and we could have made soup. Oh, Jack, what you should have done was put that roast on your shoulder and carry it home that way. And Jack said, oh, that's a good idea, Mama. I'll do that next time. And the next job that Jack had was with a carter who pulled the packages around to be delivered. Mailman. Now, the carter had a huge job, lots and lots of boxes, over into the next town. It took them all day, even into the next, they had to stay overnight. And Jack was a young man by now, strong fella. And the carter was so pleased with all of the work that Jack had done, how carefully he handled the boxes, nothing got broken. He said, Jack, I want you to take one of the donkeys. And Jack remembered what his mother had said. He said, if you just had a few coins, that would be all right. But the carter was insistent. He said, I know your mother will use this donkey. She really needs to have this donkey. Take the donkey, Jack. And the carter left with the cart and the other donkey. And Jack looked at the donkey. Now, donkeys aren't horses, but they're not dogs either. And Jack remembered what his mother had said. So he bent over and got the hee-haw in one end and the tail, in the other ear. And he started to stand up, but a donkey is a big idea. So Jack got sort of stood up and made his way slowly down the road. Jack and the donkey over his shoulders. Now, also in this town lived a very wealthy man. Up on the hill, big beautiful house. And this man had a daughter who had never said a word in her life. And the man had taken her to doctor after doctor, wise woman, healer, any person he could find. And he finally, the last wise woman said, get her to laugh. If she laughs, she'll be able to talk. So the father put out an advertisement with a huge amount of gold as a reward. Come and make my daughter laugh. So all the young men came with jokes, with tumbling tricks, with anything they could think of, silly faces. She didn't even crack a smile. All the young lady did was sit in the front window and watch the traffic go up and down the road, in and out of town. And one day, You can imagine who she saw on the road. Because here came Jack with the donkey and the hee-haw in the tail. And she saw Jack, and she smiled. Poor Jack. She saw Jack, and she giggled a little bit. And the whole house heard. They'd been waiting her whole life for her to make a sound. By the time they got to the front room with the window, she was laughing. And the whole household laughed along with her. Her father laughed, tears running down his face. She said, "Father, look who's walking down the road, that poor man with the donkey." Her father ran down the driveway, said, "Young man, you can put the donkey down," which Jack was only too glad to do. And the father said, "Young man, come to the house and get your reward." And the young lady and Jack, they met one another. The father gave Jack his reward in gold, which Jack was smart enough to put on the back of the donkey, for gold is heavy. Now the story says Jack and the young lady, they got married. I think it's a little too soon to say that. They did like the look of one another. I do know that Jack and the donkey and the gold did make it home to Jack's mother. And Jack and his mother, maybe the young lady, lived happily the rest of their days. And the last group of people I want to mention is folks from Germany. And the folks from Germany had the same trouble as the folks in Ireland and Scotland. Religious persecution, the state saying you will be this religion or else. There were wars all over Europe, so that war and hunger and persecution between 1708 and 1760, 100,000 German immigrants came to this country. A lot of them came to Pennsylvania. A bunch of them came here. We in the United States forget the size of the countries there when we talk about the lack of land. Germany literally ran out of land. There was no more land to farm. Germany, which wasn't a country quite yet, but that area of Europe is about the size of Montana. That's all the bigger it is. Scotland and Ireland are each about the size of the state of Maine. So land was important. It was in short supply, which is one of the big reasons people came here. People came here to have a place, to have a safe place. Well, let me tell you one more story. And the tailor in this story, he just wants to have a safe and happy place to live. Now, back in those days, and we forget this part, back in those days, all clothing was made with a needle and thread. I can't imagine all of those skirts, all of that lace, the buttons. It's astonishing the amount of work that women and tailors went through to put clothing on people's backs. And tailors would sit cross-legged in their front windows, sewing seams, showing off their wares. And this tailor was well known in his town for the excellence and the quality of his clothing. But he had a problem, you see. The tailor was sleepy, which is difficult if you want your seams to go straight. You see, someone or something was stealing the pillows, throwing the covers on the floor, marching up and down the house all night, complaining. And the tailor wasn't getting any sleep.
And he finally said, I have to do something. I can't sell these clothes. My seams are every which way. So he went across the marketplace, off into the forest, to see the wise woman. The wise woman always lives in the forest. So he went to the wise woman. He said, "Wise woman, I must be witched. Someone or something is stealing the covers, throwing the pillows on the ground, stomping up and down my house all night, complaining, and I can't sleep." And the wise woman, she smiled. She said, "You'd know if you were witched. You see, your feet would be on backwards and your hair would grow upside down." No, Jack made sure his hair wasn't upside down. He said, but what's happened? And she said, "A Hütchen has come to visit." It's a German word for little hat. "Oh no," said the tailor. "He's going to tangle all my threads. He's going to throw all my fabric out the window. He's going to throw the lace in the trees. He's going to blow the roof off. What am I going to do?" And the wise woman said, "Find him a place to sleep." "Oh," said the tailor, "that's easy. I can do that." So he thanked the wise woman, always a good idea, set back through the forest, across the marketplace, and there was a carved headboard with butterflies and flowers and birds. He said, "Oh, I'll take that." And he put it up in the middle of his house. And he said, "There, Hütchen, there's your bed and there's my bed, and we'll both get a good night's sleep tonight." And the tailor ate his dinner, and he plumped up its pillow. Well, you know what it's like to look forward to a good night's sleep. And he went to put his head down. And the voice complained, "Too high and too wide. Too high, too wide." All night long. And imagine the covers and the pillows ended up on the floor too. Too high, too long, all night long. So the tailor got up the next morning. All right, another bed. So he went for a walk in his garden. He brought in some moss and ferns, and he made a tiny little garden in the corner. There, Hütchen, there's your nice little tiny bed. And he had his dinner, and he plumped up his pillow, and he went to put his head down. And the voice complained, "Too tickly and too scratchy. Too tickly, too scratchy." All night long. No sleep that night for the tailor. He got up the next morning. It's hard to think when you haven't slept. The linen closet, it's nice and soft in there. So he made a little space, scooched all the pillows and the towels aside. He said, "There, Hütchen, there's one that's nice and comfy for you, cozy." And he had his dinner, and he plumped up his pillow. He was still thinking like this was a positive, get a good night's sleep. He did start to lay his head down, and the voice complained, "Too dark and too stuffy. Too dark, too stuffy, too stuffy, too stuffy." All night long. And the tailor didn't get any sleep. The tailor was at the end of his thread. He couldn't think of one more bed to make for this little fairy. He decided, I need a treat for dinner. So he gave himself a walnut, a nice rich walnut. He cracked it in half and ate the nut meat out of the shell. And then he noticed it looked just like a bed. What have I got to lose? So he put a little peach fuzz on the inside to make it soft, bright red maple leaf on the top to make it pretty, and he set it on the windowsill. And he plumped up his pillow. But then he heard the most contented humming throughout the house. Must be the Hütchen. And he tiptoed over to the windowsill, didn't want to wake him up. And he lifted the maple leaf, and inside that walnut shell was a speck not as big as an apple seed. and he heard the voice say, "Just so. Just so. I like a bed made. Just so." And finally, the tailor and the urchin got their good night's sleep. Thank you all so very, very much for coming. I know you all got a little piece of paper. The Arts Council would really appreciate it if you would fill that out. Back on the table by the hot chocolate or by the things that the Historical Society has for sale, there is a bibliography of all of the sources that I used to create this Oh My Goodness program. Thank very much the Arts Council. Thank you so much to the librarians and especially Holly Watson, our county historian, who showed me that a lot of those sources are online. So they are very easy to get to. A lot of Livingston County history is written down. Thank you so much for coming.